maybe less
All
fast.
right. E- can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Mic check, all good?
Let me just pop you like that. Yep, go ahead, Leafy. Thanks very much.
Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there, but I hope the backdrop of Monash car park is also nice. All right. I'm here to give you a quick overview of part of my PhD project, which is about individual call recognition. And for this project, our goal is to combine passive acoustic monitoring and deep learning techniques to establish a population estimation method for the little penguins at St Kilda, or at the very least, lay the groundwork for such a method. We're still very much in the prototyping proof of concept phase, but early results are, we're fairly optimistic about it. But I'll give you a quick overview of what we've done so far. Cool. So that was a lot of words. I'll quickly explain what those words mean, first of all. So traditionally, the way to collect data for population estimates has been fairly labor intensive, costly, and sometimes invasive to the actual animals themselves. So, for example, at St Kilda, I know there was like manual accounting along the breakwater where you like walk up and down with a group of people, which just costs a lot of time, effort, and some also do the injection of these little tags into them, and that's naturally invasive. And one of the emerging methods to collect data in a different way has been to leverage acoustics. So specifically, in this case, the animal vocalizations. And what this method essentially does is it uses autonomous recording units, so just normal audio recorders spread out into the wild, um, and just records endless amounts of data. And number one, this is non-invasive because we don't actually interact with the animals themselves. We just put it out, wait a few days, weeks, and later come collect them. And this also means that it's highly scalable. So the same method that you use for few square meters, you can do along the entire breakwater. And this is like an enormous advantage. And this way of gathering data um, would just be extremely beneficial for this endeavor. Um, All right. So how does this actually work? Um, we use something called song meters. So these are just pretty much palm-sized devices, put it out into the wild. As I said, we drop them out. They record endless amounts of data, and then we come back and collect them later, and then process all this data. So with deep learning techniques, we're able to process this data very quickly because, as you can imagine, if we spread out tens of recorders and record for 12-ish hours a day, it very quickly turns into an enormous amount of data that you can't manually sift through. But using deep learning techniques, we can very quickly filter out the important bits that we want, and like do useful and interesting stuff with it. All right, that's one side of it. And now the other question is, what type of sounds are we looking for? What type of sounds do we want to sift through in this enormous batch of data that we get? So then switching over to a bit more biology. So many species have exhibited individually unique vocalizations. Pretty much in the context of little penguins, this means um, they need to somehow recognize their partners. And when they go out foraging during the day and come back at night, they need to somehow find their nest, or rather their partners. And they do this by vocalizing. And naturally, to find your partner, you need to know what your partner sounds like, and you need to figure out that they don't sound like their neighbors or something. So it's been long speculated that uh, they have individually distinct vocalizations. But as part of our project, we set out to actually prove this and show that, like, yes, we can actually tell the differences. So the interesting part of this is that we as humans, or at least I as a human, cannot tell the difference between them vocalizing. But if you show a deep learning system enough examples of penguin A called like this and penguin B calls like this, and then you give it a random other vocalization and ask it which penguin was it, a deep learning system will do this very, very well and can tell you the very fine differences. So in this image, you can see the call of three individual penguins visualized, and to me, they look very, very similar. There's a few fine differences between them, but like if you showed me one of these, I couldn't tell you who it was. But if we show this to a deep learning system, it very accurately can do this. So, that's kind of like two ends of the spectrum, and now it's kind of about, well, what good is this? Um, yeah. So what I've said so far is we can collect an enormous amount of data. We can sift through enormous amounts of data and find vocalizations of individuals. And we know that the individuals all vocalize differently. So what good is this? Well, if you go to this, um, if we know all this, we can spread out recorders along the entire breakwater and just record, for example, overnight. Then we have this enormous batch of data where we assume most or all the penguins will have vocalized. We take all of these vocalizations, feed it to a deep learning system that says, I know there are going to be unique vocalizations inside of this batch of data, figure out how many of them there are. And by figuring out how many unique vocalizations we have, this directly relates to how many actual penguins there are on the breakwater, and that is essentially a population estimate that could be useful for conservation purposes. But Flossie will, I guess, talk more about the actual use case and applicability of this.
Thanks, Lifi. Yeah. I mean, yeah, so that sort of covers a lot of it, but ideally what we would be able to do is have citizen scientists who can go out and be the ones who are changing over the recorders, however frequently that needs to be. So that gives people an opportunity to contribute to this research, but without it being, as Leafy has said, invasive to the penguins, and collecting really reliable data for monitoring. So, for example, what we're sort of imagining is if we've got an array out across the whole breakwater, we could use what Leafy's designing to identify how many penguins there were on that night. So say there were 300 penguins on the breakwater on one night. We can then compare that, depending on how frequently, how much data we want to collect. But we can compare that throughout over many years. And if we've got most nights of the year being recorded, we'd get a really, really good picture of occupancy along the breakwater over time. And so we'd be pretty confident that if we were getting 300 per night on average, say in January in one year, and then in January the next year, we were getting only 200 per night, then we might start to think that that's looking like there's a downward trend in the population size. And so then that's our cue to intervene and start figuring out what's going on. So it's just a really great way of keeping an eye on the colony. We can also measure if there's any increase in population size as well, if we were to introduce any sort of conservation measures. We could also look at occupancy across the breakwater. So something that might be of interest to us is once we may not be ready in time, but once the breakwater is reopened and there are people coming into the public section, we could look at how occupancy of penguins changes over time in the public section relative to the restricted section, for example. And we could also start to use this information to understand the exact timing of breeding as well. For example, if we knew that peak calling happened during incubation or guard, then we could, start to use these calls to understand when the penguins are breeding each year. So there's a lot we can do with it, and we're really hopeful that it will be a really precise way of monitoring the population. One day in the future, it'd be really cool if we could get it to the point where we knew the individual penguins. It's like, this is Paul. Paul is calling tonight, and he came back 2 weeks later. We're not there, and we probably won't be there for a little while, but one day that would be really cool if we could assess the entire population and know them all uniquely. But that's not in the scope of this. So yeah, and that's it for us.
Thank you, Flossie and Leafy. Leafy, could you just stop sharing for me, please? Thank you, dear. Great. That's just so exciting to hear about that. I'll just turn you around so you can see the crew. Any questions? Look at them all. Aren't they beautiful? Any
Yay.
questions for Flossie or Leafy? Yeah.
What's the range of the recorder? So how many would you need the breakwater?
Could you hear that?
No, I'm going to need someone to repeat.
What's the range of the recorder? How many would we need on the breakwater?
Leafy, I'll turn that one over to you. We're still verifying, but
Yeah. So currently we've used, I mean, these handheld recorders. The vertical range is roughly 2 to 3 meters in both directions. So it's roughly 5 meters circular then. And how many we need? A good amount. But the side note is these recorders haven't really been tuned to, like, we haven't actually tried to make the radius larger. This is just kind of the default setting. I'm sure you can increase the recording radius a little bit, but as of right now, you would either need stronger recorders or just a lot more to cover the breakwater. I think guesstimation wise, double digits, but hard to say as of right now.
Great.
there is also an opportunity to use really cheap recorders. There are companies that are developing or that have released really cheap, accessible recorders. So if we needed bulk, we would be able to make that work. But hopefully we can stick with the song meters.
Yeah, sorry, I should have added that. So the handheld recorders are like very useful for certain things, but if we want to cover a large area, as Flossie said, much smaller, cheaper ones with slightly smaller radius, but a lot more of them would just as well do the job.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, like, totally get how deep line would be able to different things. But with cold, your penguins might think they tied to the cold, and how would you do that? Are you looking at, like, does it need to recognize different types of calls on penguins, particular calls, not double counting? Is that makes sense? Or are you just comparing the overall origin that there's this many unique calls, therefore with size?
Did you catch that?
Number of calls changes over time.
So if Paul's calling and he's really angry, and Paul's calling and he's looking for a lady friend, is this the sort of, so is that recognizing it as two different penguins, or is that Paul but saying two different things?
A bit hard to answer. Because to know this, you need to first of all have shown the system first. This is what Paul sounds like when he's angry, and this is what Paul sounds like when he's calling to his mate. But the assumption is that if we
Sorry, hold on, Leafy, I got it wrong.
Like,
Oh.
but the question is, are you distinguishing types of calls, or is the comparison just, we've had 500 unique calls this month, and the following year there's 700. It's not saying there's 700 individuals. It's saying there's a change of population.
Right.
I understand what them is.
Did you nodding, Flossie? Did you hear that?
I think I caught that. Are you asking about whether we're sort of counting the total number of unique penguins within the population, or the sort of the unique ones each night?
Yes, and what are we monitoring? The change in unique call, the possible change in unique penguins. I can ask later. I'm not.
I missed that last part, but I think the answer is that what we're measuring is the total number of unique calls each night, because we can't kind of assign them to separate penguins. It's just the number of unique ones each night. So the 500 that we're calling on the first night, some of them may be the same 500 that we're calling on the second night, but we don't know. It's just 500 and then compared to 500.
Nailed it. Thanks, Flossie. Time for one more question, if there's anything out there.
Yeah, I just had a similar question around. It'd be interesting building off yours to sort of do it in a closed environment, like a zoo, or where you knew the number, and how that then related to the number of calls you're getting, and whether you could then use the number of individual calls to estimate a population.
That sounds like a whole PhD chapter, Leafy. Did you catch that?
Could you repeat it again?
If you did it in a closed population and knew how many birds were there, could you then
Yeah.
use that information to extrapolate
Calls to population.
calls to population? Yeah, got it.
Is what we're that is what that's the next step. So we are Leafy's spoken about how sometimes this has been tested in zoos, and that's a really easy way to do it because you know the total number of individuals that are there. But what we want to test it in the field, we want to make sure it works on the breakwater. So what we'll be doing is putting out an array of a known location, a specified location, and then we will go out and do a survey of that exact area. We're going to have to try and pick areas that are maybe, you know, not sort of densely populated right on the border, because then that would create some confusion between which ones are in and out. But yeah, we'll strategically pick some locations on the breakwater that we can try and do that test where we, in one night, we identify the number of penguins as a human in that doing a survey compared to the acoustic recorders and compare how many we both count.
Amazing. Thank you, Flossie. Thank you, Leafy. I have a little gift for you here. I'll get it to you somehow. Thank you for your time and apologies about the confusion about the start time. Please join me to thank Flossie and Leafy.